Welcome to the NewsHour. Former President Jimmy Carter tonight is being remembered as a humanitarian and statesman more than 40 years after leaving the White House. The 39th president, who died yesterday at 100, will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol next week before his funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. Laura Barone-Lopez begins our coverage.
Flags were lowered across the country and around the world. And Americans of all backgrounds paused to remember late former President Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter has always been a hero of mine.
He was just a good man, a decent man, an honest man, something we don't see very much of him now.
He was a great humanitarian. He set an example for all of us, and we're going to miss him.
From peanut farmer to president, Carter served one term in the White House, from 1977 to 1981. He brokered a historic peace deal between Israel and Egypt. But an energy crisis at home and the kidnapping of 52 Americans in Iran led to his defeat in 1980. Carter's life post-presidency was defined by his international humanitarian work. He and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center, and he earned a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his diplomatic achievements. Last night, President Biden broke from his nation to pay tribute to his longtime friend.
Millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
Former presidents from across the political spectrum also weighed in. President-elect Donald Trump has been critical of Carter in the past, but he wrote last night that he truly loved and respected our country and all it stands for. Former President Barack Obama said that Carter believed some things were more important than re-election, things like integrity, respect, and compassion. The former president will be laid to rest in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, next to his wife of more than 75 years, Rosalind, who passed away in 2023. One of the couple's final public interviews was with the NewsHour's Judy Woodruff back in 2021.
As you think back on your presidency and your time as a former president, what are you most proud of, and is there a big regret you have?
I would say that we did what we pledged to do in the campaign. We kept the peace, and we obeyed the law, and we told the truth. And we honored human rights. Those were the things that were important to me.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Laura Barone-Lopez.
And for more on President Carter's life and legacy, I'm joined by Judy Woodruff, who you just saw there and has covered the Carters for more than 50 years, as well as James Fallows, Carter's speechwriter during the first 2 years of the administration, and Kai Bird, author of The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Thanks very much to all of you. Welcome back to the NewsHour. Judy, let me start with you. Jimmy Carter grew up on a peanut farm, no electricity, no running water, the first member of his family to graduate high school. Just remind us, how far was his journey to the White House?
It was the longest imaginable journey, Nick. You're right, a peanut farm in the deepest of rural southwest Georgia, Plains, the town that we've all come to identify with him, to reach the pinnacle, the most powerful job in the world, and unimaginably to leave office in a state of, if you will, political failure. Not winning re-election, but then here we are 44 years later, and we are celebrating the life, the legacy of this man who did come from that very simple beginning, but against all odds achieved everything that he achieved.
Kai Bird, against all odds, as I said, you called your book The Outlier. How was Jimmy Carter an outlier?
Well, he was an outlier for all of the reasons that Judy just explained. He came from these very Spartan circumstances, no running water, an outhouse. He was virtually raised in the 19th century and now has lasted 100 years into the 21st century. And, you know, he was an extraordinary man, but I think Judy and Jim will all agree that he was just relentless. He was a workaholic. He, in the White House, he was devoted to figuring out the right thing to do and studying the memos. He would read 200 or 300 pages a day. And I don't know, Jim saw him on a more daily basis. I was just the biographer, but, he could be acerbic and difficult. People have this warm and fuzzy perception of him, but he was a tough guy to interview, precisely because he was so smart and quick and knowledgeable.
Jim Fallows, you wrote some of those memos. You were in the White House at the beginning. Carter came to power after the twin traumas of Vietnam and Watergate. He promised never to lie and to help heal America. At first, did it work?
It did work at first. And I think something that's very difficult for people now in America who think of Carter only as this grandfatherly figure wearing a cardigan, doing good works around the world, to imagine how magical he seemed when he came practically from nowhere in 1976. I think he still has the record for the quickest ascent from 1% name recognition in the United States and 1 year later being sworn in as president. And part of what he was able to do was because he seemed to capture the spirit of that time. He was going to be honest. He was hardworking. He embraced all kinds of culture, black and white. He was a military officer who also was against the Vietnam War. He was a friend of Bob Dylan. He quoted Dylan Thomas. He had Martin Luther King Sr. as one of his supporters. So there was what Democrats would associate with the early Barack Obama, or Republicans perhaps with Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter had in a pure form when he first came onto the scene.
And yet, Judy Woodruff, as Jim Fallows just said, the magic of Carter's first days wore off. His approval rating dropped from 70% to 28% from 1977 to 1978. Was that, in fact, in part because of the outsider status, perhaps the outsider staff that you brought with him, and it helped create the impression among some that he was frankly out of his league?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that he didn't really love the idea of bending to the ways of Washington. He brought his team, largely a very loyal Georgia team, with him to Washington. They surrounded him at the White House until about 3 years into the administration, when he finally did bring in some more Washington experienced hands. But you have to say the country was experiencing inflation. Gas prices were high. He was plagued in the last year of his presidency by the terrible Iran hostage crisis, where dozens of Americans at the embassy in Tehran were taken hostage, held for a year. He had the failed helicopter, the attempt to send in helicopters to rescue them, a crash. There were so many things that happened that were bad luck. And you could attribute it to his great ambition, his determination to make a difference against all odds. But part of what happened, I would say, is the fact that he didn't want to bend. He didn't want to do things the way Washington had always done it. To him, it was more important to try to do, quote, the right thing than to worry about what was going to get him reelected.
Kai Bird, on foreign policy, Judy just mentioned the hostages, of course, in Iran, but a signature achievement of President Carter was a peace treaty that he personally helped between Egypt and Israel that stands to the day. Do you believe that that is his crowning foreign policy achievement? And how did he stay focused on Israel long after that?
Oh, that was a crowning achievement. It was an extraordinary episode in personal diplomacy. It just wouldn't have happened without Jimmy Carter. And yet, it was an achievement of a cold peace between Israel and Egypt. But people should remember that Carter believed he also got an agreement, a road path to autonomy and maybe a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, and that Begin reneged on it. And he spent
Begin, the prime minister of Israel, that signed the Camp David Accords.
Yes. And Carter just believed that Menachem Begin had promised him one thing and then walked out the door and reneged. And he spent the rest of his life warning the Israelis that they were going down a road towards apartheid if they kept building settlements in the West Bank. And of course, that was not a popular thing to say. But this is Jimmy Carter. He is a prophet in the wilderness, and prophets are often unpopular. And he was relentless. And I have to say, looking at where we are today, I think he's been proven correct. And that's why we still have a terrible conflict in the Middle East today.
Israel, of course, denies that it's got anything to do with apartheid, but I want to keep going. Jim Fallow's other foreign policy legacies, turning over the Panama Canal to Panama, something criticized not only by his opponent, President Reagan, eventually, but also recently by President-elect Trump. We mentioned Iran, of course, normalization with China. How much of Carter's legacy is defined by those topics, and what was most important to him?
So I think in addition to the Camp David Accord, where I agree with what Kai Bird just said, I think that Carter would rank two other achievements in foreign policy. One was the Panama Canal treaties, which, interestingly, the first negotiations on that front had happened under Richard Nixon, and at the urging of the U.S. military, which said that unless there were some resolution of this colonialist presence in Panama, it was going to be impossible to defend the canal. And Carter defended that, and he pulled off a work of sort of political legerdemain that we don't usually associate with him in getting 68 votes in the Senate to ratify this, which involved getting a lot of Republicans to join him. So I think that was important. And also his human rights policy, which he announced during the campaign and in a seminal speech at Notre Dame in his first year of the presidency. I think that will stand in the test of time as something that in which he changed the world. Part of what he's recognized for in the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, the only president of the United States to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his work after being president, Judy Woodruff, when you asked him about his legacy, human rights was one of the main things he brought up, not only during his presidency, but afterward, right?
That's right. He was very proud of, he was not one to brag, but he was very proud of his record on human rights, as Jim Fallows just described. And he also said we kept the peace. And that was one of the central missions of the Carter, has been and is today one of the central missions of the Carter Center, which is housed and based in Atlanta to this day. They've worked in, I think, 60 countries around the world at least, promoting health in some of the poorest parts of the planet, the poorest people on Earth. Those were the people who Jimmy Carter said he wanted to pay attention to. But it was also working to find peace in regions of the world that the bigger countries often overlooked. For him, that was a huge part of what he wanted to do as his legacy. And yes, he did win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was incredibly proud of that. But I have to say one other thing that was so important to him, and that was his own faith. He was a man of Christian faith. When I interviewed him in 2021, Nick, he spoke about how he and Rosalind read verses from the Bible every night and prayed. This was a central piece of who he was, and he said as long as the American people keep faith, he said we will continue to have a strong country. So it was something that all of us will identify with him.
Jim Fallows, Kai Bird, Judy Woodruff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a passing of note, Broadway actress turned sitcom star Linda Lavin has died. In the 1970s and 80s, Lavin played the title character in Alice, delivering a weekly serving of laughs as a diner waitress raising a young son.
Where did you get that?
From Roger. I traded my electric guitar for it.
You what? He traded his life. I heard him.
The sitcom aired on CBS for nearly a decade, becoming a primetime hit and earning Lavin 2 Golden Globes. Following Alice, she returned to the stage, where in 1987 she won a Tony Award for her performance in Neil Simon's Broadway Bound. Lavin's representative says she died yesterday from complications related to lung cancer. She was 87 years old.